Please enjoy this presentation on high-density orchard management, presented by Paul Nurre. Paul obtained his bachelor's in science degree from Cal Poly Pomona, and he's the orchard manager for Oro del Norte in Somas, California.
We all know that alternate bearing is a problem. We see big fluctuations in price, and a lot of the fluctuations in price are because of the fluctuation in production. So anytime it seems like we have high yields, we have high yields, low dollars, and every time we have low yields, high dollars, so what Chuck mentioned about dollars per acre, it's one good reason to level out. We do want to level out our production, and hopefully in some of those low production years, pick those up a little bit. So our method for going about that is through pruning and girdling in high-density orchards. So a little bit of background to where we're at. We're in Somas, Ventura County. We have a little bit of diversity on the ranch. We have trees as old as 50-year-old trees. You can see them kind of thinning out. These are what we're calling our low density, and these are we have 40 acres of low density Hasson Duke 7, so these are 20 by 20 orchards, sort of a standard. We're calling them low density, maybe you call them medium density. We have some 10 to 12-year-old stuff down here. These are the high density plantings. So these are 12 by 15 plantings, 242 trees per acre, and we're really enjoying the Dusa rootstock. I'm not sure what others have found. We have a younger block. Our youngest block is, we actually did go back to some Duke 7s because we were having problems with Dusa. They do, because they are resistant to root rot, it does seem they are also intolerant to oversaturation, which is one of the reasons they're good at resisting root rot is they need less water. So if you overwater them, they get chlorotic quickly. So that's one of the reasons we jumped back into Duke 7s on what we're calling like a medium density here, 165 trees per acre. Now, having planted those, we're sort of enjoying the Dusas again, and I'm going to focus on comparing the Dusas to the high density Dusa, Hasson Dusa, to the medium density. And I need to preface everything that I talk about by saying it isn't really fair for me to put high density in direct competition with low density because I have other variables other than simply how dense are they, because I have 40-year-old low densities competing with 10-year-old high densities, so it's not really a fair race. But we are seeing that we're able to flatten production. But in both situations, we are girdling and pruning and approaching the orchard with the same approach. So the challenge that faces us all, and whether or not you girdle or not, we are trying to confront the issue of alternate bearing. And what I've kind of walked through here is sort of a three-year cycle of a year where you have large bloom, you have good set, and probably that large bloom is in a year where your picking is down. So you can start this cycle wherever you want, but you're starting with a large bloom and probably low amounts of fruit. The next year, you are picking that large bloom, but all of that fruit that you set in the prior year is restricting your ability to bloom this year. So that's kind of the sequence of this tree preferring a biannual or alternate bearing production, where a big bloom one year, it sets that fruit, next year comes around, it's restricted by the fruit that's on the tree, and it's blooming less for that reason. So, so in this third year, you have that weak, the good harvest from year two, which corresponded with a weak bloom. Now you have a limited harvest in year three, and now the trees, they don't have a big fruit load to compete with, so they're producing a lot of foliage. So the summary here, and you guys have seen it, I'm sure, is we're trying to strike a balance between the new set having a good bloom and a good set, but also not such a huge set that you're restricting canopy growth, which is the next year's bloom. So what I did, sort of just some hypothetical years here where 13 and 14, 13, big volume year, low price, 500 million pounds at 87 cents. This is all from the California Avocado Commission. So 500 million pounds at 87 cents. The next year, 300 million pounds at $1.12. So if you were able to flatten your production, and I just said 12 because we kind of like to think of 10 as we got to do 10, and people are talking in the future we got to do 20, which is hopefully the prices go up faster than, in some cases, great prices can buoy your low production. But what I did here, just hypothetically, if I did 12 both times, 12 at 87 cents, 12 at $1.12, I'm making close to 24,000 pounds, making about $24,000. If I'm fluctuating and kind of, and Mary Lou said something about a 70-30, if we're considering Hass a 70-30 or an 80-20, that's a huge swing, and this is I guess this would be a 75-25 sort of a swing. You're making $1,500 an acre less for growing the same amount of pounds. So our goal is to flatten that out, and I did just another one here, another couple years where you had a huge fluctuation, 300 million pounds at $1.52, 462 million pounds at 83 cents. So again, flattening production at 12, you're making $28,000 on 24,000. And again, we're looking at the same average. You're averaging 12. It's just we're not necessarily increasing yields. We're flattening it out. And again, you have a 1,400 pound, and this is not even a huge fluctuation, 10 going to 14. One thing that if you get too far going down, if everyone flattened out their production, maybe we wouldn't see $1.52 going to 83. So it might be something that if we all did this, none of us would see this big fluctuation. But in the meantime, if you want to try it, you can sort of take advantage of that. So our ranch philosophy, as Mary Lou said, it was sort of an undomesticated tree that wants to be biannual. We are sort of allowing it to be biannual through the girdling process. And I'm going to get into that. So that we're allowing it to, one year it produces abundant foliage. The next year it blooms on that foliage and sets fruit. The next year you pick that fruit, girdle it again. So, and we'll get into how by dividing the canopy into a 50-50 balance, you almost have two trees in one, where half of the tree you pick one year, the other half of the tree you pick the other year, and every year your goal is to pick the same amount of fruit. So for those that haven't seen girdling in action, it is a severing of the bark and phloem, and I'll get into that. But the effect of the girdling is an abundant flush of flowers. It's girdled in the fall. You have an abundant bloom in the spring, and really great, huge bloom and great retention of the bloom. It's definitely something that works on healthy trees, and that's something that I should make sure is the disclaimer throughout is if you're not producing because your tree is sick or old or dying, the solution is not girdling. Girdling is not going to change an unhealthy tree. It's going to kick a happy tree in the pants and make it push a little harder. But the first thing is irrigation, fertilization. Those come before pruning and girdling. But you do end up with large bloom and large fruit set like this when you girdle. So here's a picture of my 50-50 canopy division. So it's pretty obvious that on this side I'm blooming, and beneath all these blooms, so this is probably March, April, we're heavy into the bloom, there is almost no fruit to be harvested on this side. So let's say this was spring of 2017. There is no fruit to be harvested on this side for 2017. All the fruit is on this side, and there's no bloom going on here. So as soon as I pick this fruit, I will girdle that side in the fall, and when you come back to this same tree the following spring, this side's blooming and this side is holding the fruit. So it's kind of a 2-for-1. Two trees, one tree, 2 years of production. Part of what goes on after this heavy bloom, you have such a heavy fruit set on that tree, that very little canopy production is going to go on top of that, because the amount of fruit that's on that limb is going to arrest the amount of foliage that's being produced. So, and that's what you want, because what you want to avoid is fruiting on the same year. Going back to this image, I don't want any bloom on this side, because now I have all of this bloom and I'm dealing with extra. Now I'm looking at a traditional alternate bearing tree, which I do not want. So the amount of fruit that results from the girdle arrests the growth, and that goes back to this idea that the tree wants to alternate bear. So you're letting one side, that one side has to do is bloom, produce fruit. The next year you pick it, and the year that you pick it, you then girdle it that fall. So and you can plug in whatever years you want to plug in right here, but no matter how you plug it in, it's production every year. That's the approach that we're taking. So the 2016 girdle, this would be fall of 2016. That's the set that we are now looking at today, the 2017, the young crop, as opposed to the 2017 pick. So the 2016 girdle becomes the 2017 bloom and set, and then it's the 2018 harvest. That side, and the opposite side would be the 2017 girdle, which would be the 2018 bloom, the 2019 harvest. So you've divided your tree in half. So the limb bearing the fruit harvested in 2017 will usually be the limb that is then girdled. So the earlier you get that fruit off, and getting back to how many months of the year can we try to market to get out of risk, we do like to pick as early as we can. We know that Mexico has better quality in January, February, but if you can, in high density plantings, less fruit per tree, we do try to remove as many 48s as we can, knowing that what we pick in a given year, that side is going to be girdled at the end of that fall. So the more I can strip fruit off of that, get into a February pool, get into a March, we try to pick as many 48s as we can every 8 weeks, from possibly as early as February, and in a big crop year, we're still picking in August, getting into a lot of different pools and spreading the risk, knowing that early on the prices are not as good as we usually always see, but knowing that if I leave all of that fruit on that tree, I'm going to have a weakened limb to girdle come that fall. So the quicker I can get fruit off and refoliate that limb, I'm going to have something good to girdle. So this is a picture, a little hard to see, but sort of like that other picture I was showing with bloom on one side and foliage on the other. I have fruitlets here. This is probably an early summer fruit set. This side would be my harvest, and it's also going to be my girdle for that year. So same image from before. A 2016 girdle is a 2017 set, is a 2018 harvest. This side would be a 2017 girdle, which would be a 2018 bloom, a 2019 harvest. So I'll get a harvest 2018, 2019. These are the tools of the trade. Larger trunk, larger saw. So we will girdle with this small, it's a pipe saw. It's a plumber's saw or a hacksaw. And we cut the blade in half and wrap it with a handle, wrap it with some tape, and we are girdling the first year that we plant. So that 2013 block was planted in April, girdled in October of the same year. And then we've toyed with, our own invention. This is a Sawzall blade. You've probably seen it for a Sawzall. This is the tip of of this same 12-inch Corona blade, fixed with another handle. When you're inside the crotch of a smaller tree, it's hard to work your way around that tree. And what I didn't include, I should have put a video into this slideshow, but you are severing, in Spanish it's the anillo, it's a ring. You're cutting a single slice around the limb that you're working on, And this shows here, you have bark and cambium and phloem on the outside, and inside of that softer tissue is the hard wood that's on the inside. So you are severing up until you get to that hard wood. So obviously the bigger the tree, you're going to have more bark to get through. That's why on our large trees, our 40-year-old trees, we have a full pruning saw that we're taking out there. This is a 6-inch saw, and we do like, the curved blades are nice because as you're working your way around a rounded column, it's more kind of ergonomic. The girdle will learn to stop at this layer, at the woody layer. It is distinctly harder. When those teeth hit that harder wood, you feel it. And as soon as you get to it, now you're just sliding across the surface of it. Again, the saw should sever entirely the bark, phloem, and cambium, stopping at the sapwood. Our girdling is performed October 15th to November 15th. The idea is there's a six-week healing time between when you've severed that and when it'll start to bleed immediately. You'll get sap, within a week. You'll have white, sugary sap coming down the trunk. 6 weeks later, it ought to be healed. You don't see the effects of the girdle until probably the following February, because at that moment, all of the leaves that are on that tree, they start to donate their nitrogen to the bloom. So all of those leaves yellow and crumple just before a very heavy bloom. And when you can see the effect of a girdle immediately. By immediately, I mean when you arrive at the grove, you'll see that it has been girdled, and you'll think you're doing something wrong to your trees that February. You don't see any type of immediate response from the girdling, but 6 weeks after the girdle, it should have calloused, healed, and we like, especially in our cold areas, we like to do this close to October 15th, so we're starting in 2 weeks here. But hoping, with the idea being, if you're in a cold area, 6 weeks later, you're ready to resist some cold. We don't like going into the cold. To go along with the girdling, when we talk girdling, we talk pruning, and when we talk pruning, we talk girdling, because once you are girdling, once that is your strategy, the pruning is tied directly to the girdling process. So what the rule number one that I've put here is to leave enough capacity for this year's girdle. When I say capacity, I mean unrestricted foliage that isn't being tied down by holding this year's fruit. So I don't want to prune off what I have in light supply. And I've tied that to this little rule here. If I see that tree like that, the goal being 50-50, if I encounter a tree that is more like 70% blooming and 30% green, if I go in to prune that tree, I'm going to probably prune the bloom. I'm not going to prune the green side because I'm trying to achieve a balance. And same thing here, excess bloom, I'm pruning bloom. Excess foliage, I'm pruning foliage to get back down to the 50-50 concept. The separation of trees in row and between row, I would advocate that whether I girdled or not. Two trees that are crowding each other will shade out and eliminate foliage. You probably have seen it as trees get taller. They aren't just green all the way top to bottom. They tend to be wood until the green starts, and then you have 6 feet of wood, or 6 feet of foliage. So we'd rather put that 6 feet or 8 feet of foliage on the ground. That's optimal. Again, going back to this rule number one, if the only foliage you have is up in the air, I'm keeping that foliage up in the air. I'd rather have high fruit than no fruit. So, but again, the separation of trees in row and between row, if you separate them, they will put their foliage all the way to the skirt. We want to be picking, the whole reason we're high density is to try to pick without ladders. Especially if you're on terrain, we want to get off ladders, pick quick, and be more labor effective. So that's separation of trees in row and between row. The elimination of crossing branches, which I have an image for. What we tend to find, especially on young trees, if you allow a tree to put its capacity above another limb, that other limb will race to get outside of it, and pretty soon you're crowding a neighbor tree again. So the more you can keep each scaffold in its own place, you can create more upright growth. As Mary Lou was talking about in these shapes of trees, we don't like to let the Hass tell us that it's an alternate bearer. We don't like the Hass to tell us that it's a wide tree. You can make it skinny. Even though it has a tendency to go one way or the other, that doesn't mean it's always going to alternate bear. It doesn't mean it's always going to be round and bushy. You can make them tall and thin. So I've put at the end, I have control of height being, for me, one of my last concerns, having achieved these already. I have zero tolerance for trees that have crowded each other or that are crossing over on top of each other. If they want to be, we're ideally going to be 12 feet with a 12-foot spacing. We want to be 9 or 10 feet. But if my capacity doesn't start until I'm 6 feet off the ground, I'm not going to prune it to 8 just to feel good about myself. So my height is going to be probably the last thing that I worry about. But over time, that's more of the problem. If you have height problems, I would solve a height problem over time. If I have separation problems, I'm going to solve those problems immediately. Another real critical factor, and I wish I could just zoom in on these, but this is a peach girdle. So our young fruit this year was girdled in 2016. You can't see any fruit on here, but I essentially have two pieces here. This was a green girdle from 2015 that I harvest in 2017. And so this side will be what I girdle again. It has no fruit. This side has fruit that was set this spring. But one thing that I've done is opened up a window for growth that's coming from hopefully knee-high or waist-high, so that in the future I'm not just chasing myself higher and higher up into these trees. And again, what I said about I'm going to prune what I have in greater supply. If I have excess foliage, I'm cutting foliage. If I have an opportunity to make a low cut, and on this tree the cut was made right about here, I don't need to make a very low cut to open up a good window. If by making this cut, I can get growth down here, and that's where I want to continuously be rejuvenating from the bottom. And this is sort of that same idea, sort of advanced a little bit farther. But I do like making those low cuts when I can, so that I can eventually eliminate an entire limb like this, which I think is necessary for constant rejuvenation, especially in high density, to make those big low cuts. But they need to be done wisely. So this is a little picture that I came up with because taking photos of avocado trees is harder than just drawing a picture yourself. So what I sort of illustrated, this limb here is the one that I've removed, so that this side of the tree can go up. It can be more upright, and it doesn't just seek that sunlight getting out of its own shade, which is going to run that limb immediately into its neighbor. A lot of us have seen, if you make a wound, you make a cut, the avocado tree wants to grow straight up out of that cut, and a lot of times you have to chop the top off to get it to go lateral. If you give it the windows that it wants, it tends to grow upright, and you can control the height there. But if you don't give it the window, it still wants to grow, and it's going to go lateral, and that'll be the stuff that you either girdle it and it's getting no sunlight. A girdle without sunlight doesn't work, and a girdle without or bloom without sunlight doesn't get pollinated. It doesn't set. So you can girdle whatever you want. If it's not being exposed to the sun, it doesn't set. So I like eliminating these crossing over branches. It also stimulates what I showed in these photos. Nice big windows, and you constantly have new flush coming from down low. These are our production numbers, and what we're seeing. I mean, this is a 6-year average. And we're in the mid-12s here as a 6-year average. And some of our low density, this is a 40-year-old tree, and it's still doing 12.4. So these are not unproductive trees, but I put the standard deviation here, and I want to talk to Mary Lou about how that alternate bearing number that she said, where I think 0 was not alternate bearing and 1 is maximum alternate bearing, they have a lower standard deviation, which means they're not deviating as far from the mean. So I don't want to just have my average be 12 or 14. I don't want it to just be my average. I want it to be the number that I do every year. I want to produce and if we can then increase that number, I mean, if we went 19, 11, 13, 16, and that's about a 15,000 pound average over those 4 years. But what I'd like to see is 15, 15, 15, 15. I don't want it to be 31 year, 0 the next. My 2-year average is 15. That's one way to achieve 15 every year, but I actually want 15 every year, not to average it. And again, what I talked about earlier was it isn't fair for me to just compare this is what low density does and this is what high density does. They are older trees. We did have salinity damage in some of these old ones. They are on different rootstocks, and on the reverse, these high density numbers that are lower, the high density does get colder. They trap more air, which is good when it's windy, but it's bad when it's cold. So some of these lower numbers, I believe that when these are properly cold protected, and we get some rain and all the other factors that can contribute, we have a nice crop hanging on these high density trees for this year, and the other half of that tree ready to be girdled, which looks pretty happy too. So if I can see those two things, I can almost project 2 years into my future. The pruning cost per acre, sort of in contrast, well, similarly to the girdling costs, it is about double. But in this case, well, this is approaching, you know, $4 or $5 a tree, and because these are 242 trees per acre, I'm looking at $1,000 an acre of pruning, compared to a low density that is 109 trees per acre. The pruning cost per tree is actually a little bit high, and all of this would make sense. A bigger tree, more dollars per tree to prune it, but with less than half the trees per acre, it is a notable difference in pruning cost. But I will say, and what Keith hinted on, because my predecessors didn't know what they were doing, no one's going to watch this video, right? No. Or my predecessors not going to? We really were struggling with the high density. So I still believe that we are in sort of a catch-up phase. Some of these trees are, as I said, 80%. If the height of your trees is going to be 80% of your spacing, we have 18-foot trees in a 12 by 15 spacing. So some of these numbers, I don't think that's where we're going to end up. We ought to end up at a lower number because we're not taking as much wood off of these trees. I'll just close my thought on high density. Sort of like the solar field here, when you look at these high density plantings, you can't drive through them. You can drive through every 8th row to harvest them, but you can barely get a quad through them. And that in combination with the right windows and enough tree separation, you are maximizing your acre with canopy and fruit production. 242 trees per acre. I believe that's a big part of maximizing production and decreasing alternate bearing. I believe that 242, and I keep saying this, 242 trees per acre. I don't know if that's the number. I'd actually say, I mean, having seen 12 by 15, I wouldn't mind a 12 by 18 or something like that, maybe 200 trees per acre. But I definitely don't think 109 acre, 20 by 20 spacing, 109 trees per acre, I don't think that's the right number either. But you can see it from the satellite that we have a lot of dirt here, and I'd rather see it looking a little more like this, but also not to the extreme of tangled and crossing over and crowding. As I said, we are not fighting, we are harnessing the fact that the tree likes to be biannual. So that one side of the tree, we are allowing it to bloom one year, and then the next year pick it, and then as I described, the balance of the alternate bearing, we aren't defeating the alternate bearing. We are using it so that it alternates, but within the same tree. So we are both using and combating the kind of the biannual nature. Just to kind of revisit that pruning and girdling costs are lower per tree but higher per acre. Irrigation costs, though, are pretty much flat. Where we're at, we're using about 2.1, 2.2 acre feet per acre, regardless of high density, low density. So I think switching to high density is, even though it might be double the trees, it's not double the water because the trees are smaller. Labor efficiency is higher, less ladders, less walking tree to tree. Again, the satellite and this amount of green compared to all these holes, the weeds love all of those windows that are in these low density orchards. So I think that's something that I would put in another cost comparison type presentation is we go up and down these roads with Roundup constantly, and we are almost never in these fields with anything more than a backpack hitting a couple weeds, sometimes with shovels because the weeds are so few and far between. And the organic matter we prune these orchards and shred them and transport their mulch to the other blocks because they are producing so much foliage that the mulch would pile up in their own fields. So it is helpful in sort of keeping these big trees happy with added mulch and less weed, moisture retention and everything else good that mulch is helping you with. But anyway, that's sort of the summary on the weed issue, comparing the two. When we started in on a process like this, in theory, you're looking for south-facing cuts, south and southwest facing cuts. One of the issues is if you restrict yourself to I would say if you're coming in late to a big height control problem, I would probably tell my pruners, do south and southwest. Make a little solar panel or you're collecting sun from the south. Having said that, if you are in a method of girdling, I don't think you can limit yourself to saying prune the south because it's not. But I do think you can be more aggressive on south-facing cuts. But if a tree is crowding its neighbor, they need to be pruned. And I usually use the sprinkler as the midpoint. If this guy's limb is going beyond the sprinkler, at a minimum, it needs to be cut at the sprinkler or on its own side. By separating it, maybe I'm only separating it for a year and it can close again and I'll open it back up again. On an example like that, if I did have two options, am I going to prune this one or this one, I would lean on the side that's south facing. But on using this as an example, the next time I prune this tree, if this is full of fruit, my next cut is on this limb at an intermediate height. Because a big cut has already been made, once you're down to 2 scaffolds, you can't just remove another scaffold. If I have a tree that has 4 scaffolds and let's say I've girdled 2 of them and 2 of them are ungirdled, I might have the option of removing one of those non-girdled limbs if I think that other, again, it goes back to the 50-50 idea is not how many scaffolds, it's not 2 out of 4 scaffolds, it's not 1 out of 2 scaffolds to achieve 50%. 50% is 50% of the entire canopy. So I need to decide if I make a large cut, is this piece enough to set the amount of fruit that I want that year? And if we're going for 12,000 pounds, well, let's just say 10,000 pounds per acre, it's 100 fruit per tree on a 242, that's with 20 pollinators, but roughly I need 100 fruit to give me 50 pounds per tree to be at 10,000 pounds per acre. So I need to be able to look at this tree and say, when I girdle that, there need to be 100 fruit on it. If it's not big enough to do that, then I've cut too much. One of our rules is it needs to be bigger than your finger to break it off, partly because there's going to be competition within those. One of them wants to win, but definitely if one is already drooping, that's gone. I want that one that's going straight up. And definitely once I've made, not only I need to make that cut, I need to make sure nothing from this limb is draping over that. Because if you make a low cut, but it's being shrouded by another limb, it's gonna spaghetti noodle down to the ground. It needs to be, not only have you've made a low cut, but you've made a high cut above it so that it has plenty of sun to be, and to answer your question of north facing, south facing, there's a lot of ways to open a window without saying, the only place I have sun in my orchard is on my south facing. That's not how it, there's other ways to open windows, even on a north facing limb, get enough windows through your tree to grow even a north facing pruning wound that you've made. To me, probably the best time to start a girdling program is when you have a lot of fruit. Because your tree that has a lot of fruit right now doesn't want to bloom in the spring. If your tree is loaded with fruit right now, I would girdle it this October. Finding, and you know, these are kind of ideal situations where I've girdled low because this whole limb didn't have fruit. You can get up on ladders, you can find little pieces wherever you can find them. The key is recognizing what capacity looks like, what does sort of floral material look like, or material that should bloom. Because you can have a bunch of fruit on a limb, but that fruit is also covered in foliage. So you can girdle a limb that has fruit. Ideally, once the kind of momentum is built for a girdled orchard, hopefully there's no fruit on what you're girdling. That's the ideal. But if there is moderate amounts of fruit, especially with vigorous trees, you might have 50 fruit on a limb, but there's also abundant foliage on top of it. That is girdleable or potentially floral material. And I think it's the best time to girdle is when you have a lot of fruit. If you have 0 fruit on your tree, I wouldn't girdle it, because its alternate bearing tendency is going to be to bloom hard on its own. So if I have a tree, and that's one of the things that our painters sort of decide from when they arrive at a tree, hopefully there's fruit on one side, no fruit on the other. You paint the one without any fruit, and you have an enhanced bloom on that side. If you arrive at a tree that has 0 fruit, we don't girdle it, because you girdle one side, now that limb that you girdled is abundantly blooming, and the other side has a load too. You're not going to be able to put capacity on that tree at all. So the best time is to already have the ball rolling on girdling. That makes it easy. If you have a moderate to heavy crop load, that's a good time to jump into girdling. We do have a very good pool of labor that does it, and it's not as big as your picking crew. So we might end the year, we end our picking in July, August, and we send those 8 guys home, and then we try to get 3 or 4 guys back to do the painting. I mean, the first step is the painting, so you can see really easily before permanent mistakes are made, okay, at least you chose the right branch. That's the first step. And then a lot of it is that cutting of the window that I described, and you know, I'm watching a foreman and the foreman is watching his guys. But I mean, we were working with a 45-year-old foreman who's been girdling for 10, 12 years. Or at least if you've done it, I mean, 242 trees per acre is a lot of practice. All you have to do is have done it last year and you've done a couple thousand trees. But you can see really quickly, I mean, I think Keith asked me, or some people like, you know, what if you girdle it wrong? And number one, I mean, first off, I would say try not to girdle it wrong. Try to get to that exact depth. You've severed the flow, you've severed the bark, you severed the phloem, you arrive at the hardwood. There's obviously a lot more room for error in a 12-inch diameter limb, because if you slice into the xylem, you slice into the hardwood a little bit, it doesn't really change how strong that limb is. The past 5-6 years, it tends to be, I would say probably 2/3 of the guys that I had last year come back the following. So there's always enough. If I have, you know, on a girdling crew, 4 guys, 2 or 3 of them did it last year, and they might have a new guy. And the foreman is only on that new guy. I mean, he's bouncing around, but you're doing a lot of that window cutting. But even this cutting of the window, you almost need to cut the window all the way around to know that he went, not only did he get the right depth, but that he did it all the way around. Because you could cut that window at a place where, yeah, he did get to that depth. And what you don't see in this window, there's a square above the girdle and a square below it. So you can pull them both off and see that where they sliced arrived at the wood and no less than arriving at the wood. I'd rather see a groove in the wood that he went too far. Because if you don't get to the wood, the sap flow doesn't change and the girdle fails. It'll might bloom with what it intended to bloom on its own, but the girdle needs to be complete to really function. And if you're walking through a block that is 90% of your trees are following that 50-50 rule, and you find one that didn't work, you can almost always go to that girdle and see that it was incomplete. And you can see in how the callousing is formed around that wound that there's maybe a 2-inch section of a 20-inch circumference that they didn't go deep enough on. That's something that, and a lot of this stuff, I mean, it was made easier for me that I showed up at the ranch, the boss says, we girdle, that's what we do here. We also have these guys that are good at girdling. They taught me how to girdle. So, but now, I mean, now that I know, I can be one of the teachers, but there is a pool of smart labor experienced. And I think they know too that if you get the same crew that girdles to also prune, to also pick, these guys get really territorial about, I girdled your whole ranch for $12 an hour, and now you're letting some guy pick it because they know they know it works, and they know that on a day that you're picking, you're getting $60 a bin, and they're picking 3 bins, 4 bins a day, they're making $200 a day. When they're girdling, they're making $100 a day. So these guys don't like it if you give away their picking to, I did all the girdling, I did all the pruning, I was getting paid $12 an hour, and now you call in a bunch of pickers to pick all the fruit that I made. So I think when you have the same pool of labor, they know that the girdling works. They know if they do it wrong, it's less fruit to pick. So theoretically, it's its own incentive. In addition to, they don't want to be the guy that I cut a window in, but you don't always need to cut that window to really see that you've gotten that far. You get a feel for, I mean, even just light variations in the color of the wood. The phloem's a little bit darker. You get to that bright wood. The sawdust looks different. And if there's too much sawdust, now you're into the sapwood. So there's other little signs other than just cutting 100 little windows and following every girdler with a knife to see how deep he went. But so the guy's got a holster with a 10% bleach solution, and it's, you slice a tree, you spray it down, slice a tree, spray it down, yeah. We, on our youngest blocks, we only have Edinger and Zutana. And we literally have 8 Hass trees around every pollinator. So it is 1 out of 9 trees. On our older blocks, we have bacon. I mean, throughout the ranch, we have Witzel's, and but as far as putting stuff in, Zutano Edinger. And I probably should just eliminate the number 1 because I think 4 is the better rule. If I only have a little bit of bloom, I'm going to let it violate almost any rule that it wants to violate. You know, if it's too tall, I'm going to leave. So when I said leave enough capacity for this year's girdle, that also would apply to leave enough bloom for some sort of a harvest. So, and that's why I tied it to block 4, to rule number 4, which was if a tree, let's say a tree is crowding another tree, but it's the only green limb that I have to perform a good girdle, I'll prune the other tree to separate it. I'll let that tree be out of its spot, and I'll prune another. I'll let one of them break the rule and punish the other one because that's the only limb that it has. Does that, I don't know, it's kind of hard to, but if I only have a little bit of, really just, I think this is the better rule to think about. If I only have a little bit of greenery, I'm going to prune bloom and leave that greenery. If I only have a little bit of bloom, I'm going to prune green and leave the small amount of bloom. If you come to a tree and this is where my capacity is, that painter needs to know maybe that limb is only 30% of the tree. I need to go find another smaller limb to get me to 50 to 60%. No painting after. The painting is prior, and then the girdle usually goes, if this is a painted stripe, the girdle is just right down the middle, so that I can show up to a tree and say, that was girdled in 2016, that was girdled in 2015, that was, you know. Let's say this year, I had 3 main scaffolds, and I'm pruning in summer of 2017. And I have 2 large limbs that are both potentials to be girdled this year. I can eliminate one of them entirely if I want to, if I deem that other one enough to hold this year's crop. If I only have, if the reverse is true, 2 of them are holding fruit, one of them is not holding fruit, that's what I'm going to girdle. I can't just chop that whole piece off. That one will need to be pruned, separating trees, height control, but it won't be that big cut. What I like to tell the pruners is start with the minimum cuts. I'm 100% sure that I want these trees to be separated by 3 feet. Once I've done that, then I can say, well, that's a lot of wood to arrive at a couple little green twigs. I'm going lower, you know. But the minimum is the trees need to be separated. If 2 of them are crossing, I'm going to start at the sprinkler and I'm going to open them both. If I'm pruning this limb, I know I'm going to girdle it. I want some of that fluffy fur to come back. If I open it up by 3 feet and some of it has just 1 season's worth of growth, that could be girdleable material at that point. I want it to refoliate itself, put another layer of fur on because I'm going to girdle that. But definitely, if you make a big cut like this, that cut's going to last you 3 years. I mean, it's going to take you 3 years for this piece to be big and be able to produce 30, 40 fruit of its own. If this is the piece that I plan to girdle, I don't want to go too far back off of it. I'm going to, at the minimum, if I'm going to girdle that, I want it to be separated from its neighbors because I know bees and light can't get in if the trees have collapsed on themselves. But if I open them only by 3 feet, I know I've only done 1 year's worth of work and it's going to be back next year. That's kind of what you're getting at, right? When I'm deciding whether any particular cut that I'm making, whether it's high or low, if it's high in the air and I leave a nub on it, I'm more likely to have 5 new branches coming off of that. If I prune that flush, I'm less likely to have anything re-sprout off of that. So for me, the lower the cut, the more I leave, because that's right where I want my growth to be. I'd rather have 50 new suckers and thin them out than cut something flush and have nothing. So, I mean, this wound that I made, you know, this was a pretty flush wound. If I'm cutting at head height, I'm going to probably cut them flush. You know, I don't necessarily want sprouting right here. You know, I want sprouting right here. And I definitely don't want any foliage here drooping down over this new growth, you know. So that would be my general rule is the lower the cut, you're leaving a piece. You want new sprouts to come low. And then thin them out. The ones that are immediately after sprouting, they're crossing back over the tree. Those are the first ones to go.